The Olympic class. Some travelers want to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, while others are more than content to sit back and enjoy the ride. The beginning of the 20th century ushered in a new era of transatlantic seafaring that revolved primarily around luxury, while speed came secondary to sailing in style. Construction on the British Royal Mail ship Olympic began in December 1908 as part of the White Star Line's plan to create a new class of luxury vessels. These new vessels were capable of competing with the Cunard Line's highly profitable transatlantic passenger service. Built in Belfast, Ireland at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, the Olympic was the lead ship of a namesake-class trio of passenger vessels, which were designed with first-class comfort in mind. The RMS Olympic was also the lesser-known sister ship to the Titanic. It was just a few inches shorter than its 883-foot-long counterpart and was 3 inches wider, with a beam measuring 92 feet 9 inches. The two ships were also close in gross tonnage, with the Titanic only slightly surpassing the Olympic. The Olympic embarked on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York on June 14, 1911, roughly 10 months before the Titanic's ill-fated maiden voyage. A third Olympic-class sister ship, the HMHS Britannic, entered service in 1915 as a World War I hospital ship. Like the RMS Olympic, it was just a few inches shorter than the Titanic. At 94 feet wide, it boasted a slightly bigger beam than the other Olympic-class ships, and it was heavier than both of its sister vessels. We all know what happened to the so-called unsinkable Titanic. It plummeted to the bottom of the frigid North Atlantic just 4 days into its maiden voyage, exiting the world with so much fanfare that it remains a household name to this day. In an odd twist of irony, the Olympic and Britannic had more successful and longer-lived careers, despite their absence from the modern collective conscience. And, as you'll learn today, in some ways the history of one of these overshadowed vessels is just as interesting as that of their doomed sister ship. The RMS Olympic. Let's face it, the Titanic didn't set the bar very high in terms of how long a ship had to last in order to outlive it. Its days-long career makes the Britannic's year and some change of service before it struck a mine in 1916 seem like a long time. But both the Titanic and the Britannic's lifespans pale in comparison to that of the Olympic, which entered service in 1911 and operated for nearly a quarter century. Today, the Olympic is the least known of the Olympic-class ships, yet she was by far the longest-lived and arguably the most unsinkable of the three. She also saw immense fame throughout her lifetime, serving as a top method of travel for the who's who of the day, including celebrities and other public figures. When she first took to the high seas, she was the world's biggest ship, only to be surpassed slightly by the Titanic less than a year later. The Olympic's first 4 voyages were rather uneventful. During her 5th voyage in September 2011, she collided with the British cruiser HMS Hawke in a strait called the Solent, which separates the Isle of Wight from mainland Britain. The Hawke's bow, which was designed to sink ships by ramming them, struck the Olympic's starboard side, tearing 2 large holes in the vessel's hull. Thankfully, the heavily damaged Olympic managed to limp back to Southampton on her own power, despite having a twisted propeller shaft and 2 flooded compartments. She narrowly avoided capsizing, and miraculously no lives were lost and nobody was injured. Less than 2 months after undergoing extensive but hasty repairs, the ship returned to service. The Titanic Disaster. It's a little-known fact that the Olympic delayed the Titanic's maiden voyage. In February 2012, just a few months after re-entering service, following her collision with the HMS Hawke, the ship lost her propeller blade while sailing from New York to Europe. To expedite the Olympic's return to the high seas, Harland and Wolff diverted resources from the Titanic's construction, pushing her maiden departure back by 3 weeks from March 20th to April 10th. When the Titanic sank on April 14th, the Olympic was en route back to Europe on a return voyage from New York. She was roughly 505 miles from the Titanic when she received its distress call. The Olympic's captain at the time, Herbert James Haddock, changed course in the direction of the ailing sister ship and ordered the ship's engines to be sent to full power with every intention of assisting with the rescue. But when the Olympic was roughly 120 miles out from the disaster, the captain of the RMS Carpathia told Haddock not to bother. He said there was nothing to gain by continuing on course toward the Titanic and that all lifeboats were accounted for. Haddock offered to come and pick up some survivors, but the White Star Line's director Bruce Ismay ordered the Carpathia's captain to turn it down. Ismay was worried that boarding a ship that looked so similar to the Titanic would further traumatize the survivors. The Olympic respected Ismay's wishes and headed back towards Southampton out of respect for the wreck and its victims. All concerts on board the ship were cancelled for the remainder of the voyage. Given the similarities between the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic fell under heavy scrutiny following the sinking. Like the Titanic, the Olympic was not carrying nearly enough lifeboats to accommodate her maximum passenger capacity. There were also fears among the ship's workers that its lifeboats weren't seaworthy. Within weeks of the Titanic disaster, nearly 300 of the Olympic's firemen went on strike, refusing to work until certain changes were made. The White Star Line was more focused on staying in business than safety. Consequently, the company fired non-unionized strikers and brought a non-union replacement crew on board. This only further angered the strikers and the remaining crew members on board, who added the firing of the strikebreaker crew to their growing list of demands that the White Star Line refused to accommodate. 54 sailors stopped working mid-voyage and were arrested for mutiny when they got ashore. They were found guilty of the charges and were spared from jail time and fines due to the extenuating circumstances surrounding the case. The scales further tipped in favor of the mutineers when White Star Line officials began to fear that the public would side with them. In mid-May, just 8 days after being proven guilty, all 54 sailors were allowed to return to work. 6 months after the sinking of the Titanic, the Olympic was taken out of service for repairs and upgrades to improve safety. Its lifeboat fleet was expanded from 20 to 68. A watertight inner skin was installed to create a double hull, and various design flaws were corrected. More cabins and private bathing facilities were added, along with expanded dining services for first-class passengers. The Olympic re-entered service in May 1913 and enjoyed nearly a year and a half of peaceful service before encountering its next major mishap. Have you ever been on a cruise liner? Tell us about it in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. World War I. For a short period after Britain entered World War I in early August of 1914, the Olympic continued to operate as a passenger ship. To make it less noticeable, the vessel was painted a drab grey colour. Its deck lights were kept off and its portholes were blocked. Its first handful of wartime voyages to the United States were filled with Americans who'd become trapped in Europe and had no other way to flee. After this initial spike in ridership, however, bookings plummeted amid increasing fears among the public of a German U-boat attack. Less than 3 years after Britain joined the war, the Olympic was removed from commercial service. She embarked on her final passenger journey from New York to Glasgow with just 153 passengers on board, less than 1/16 of its total carrying capacity of 2,435 passengers. The White Star Line originally planned to lay the Olympic up in Belfast for the rest of the war, but that changed in early 2015 when the UK Admiralty requisitioned the ship as a troop transport vessel. Up until that point, the Admiralty had hesitated to use large ocean liners in the war effort due to their vulnerability to enemy fire. But a ship shortage essentially left the department with no other choice. As a troop transport, the Olympic took on a dramatically different appearance, role, and even a new name. HMT Hired Military Transport 2810. She was stripped bare of her peacetime fittings, armed with large guns, and had a carrying capacity of up to 6,000 troops, nearly 2.5 times the amount of people it was capable of transporting as a passenger ship. On September 24, 1915, the ship departed from Liverpool for Greece on its first war-related voyage. She was packed to the brim with sailors. Between then and early 1916, the Olympic carried several more shiploads of troops to the Mediterranean. From 1916 to 1917, she transported Canadian troops across the Atlantic from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Great Britain. In 1917, the vessel traded in her inconspicuous grey look for razzle-dazzle camouflage. Used by the British starting in the early 20th century, these psychedelic brightly coloured designs were not meant to hide ships, but to make them visually confusing and to make it difficult for enemies to gauge their speed and heading. Each razzle-dazzle ship had a unique color scheme and pattern. The Olympic was painted in a combination of brown, dark blue, light blue, and white. Olympic versus U-boat. After the US declared war on Germany in April 1917, the ship began carrying American soldiers to Europe by the thousands. While transporting US troops to France via the English Channel during the early hours of May 12, 1918, the Olympic's crew spotted a surfaced U-boat, U-103, roughly 1,600 feet ahead. The vessel immediately gave chase in an attempt to ram the submarine while its gunners opened fire. After realizing they were being pursued, the U-boat's operators crash dived to a depth of 98 feet, 30 meters, and shifted to a parallel course in an effort to avoid the Olympic. Unfortunately for the sub's crew, the much larger ship quickly caught up and struck U-103 with her port propeller, slicing a thick gash into its pressure hull. Left with few other choices, the U-boat's crew deliberately scuttled their vessel and abandoned it. The Olympic sustained some damage from the collision, including a twisted prow and at least 2 dented hull plates. But she continued on to Cherbourg without stopping to pick up any survivors. After spotting the U-boat crew's distress flare, the American destroyer USS Davis rescued 31 surviving crew members from the U-103 wreck. It was later revealed that the U-boat's crew was planning to torpedo the Olympic when she was spotted, but they were unable to carry out the maneuver before being struck. The Olympic's captain, Master Mariner Bertram Fox Hayes, received the Distinguished Service Order (DSO) award for his actions against U-1003. Several American service members who were on board the ship pooled their money together to buy a plaque in his honor, which was hung inside one of the vessel's lounges. Hayes was knighted in the following year for his valuable services in connection with the transport of troops. The attack on U-103 is arguably the Olympic's most famous wartime engagement, but her service was extensive. Throughout the war, she transported an estimated 201,000 troops and burned roughly 347,000 tons of coal over a roughly 184,000-mile distance. In an ironic departure from the regrettable reputation of her sister ship, the Olympic proved to be a hardy vessel, earning her the nickname Old Reliable. Post-war service. In August 1919, after putting in her wartime dues, the Olympic returned to Belfast, where she underwent a restoration in anticipation of her return to civilian service. The ship's interiors were modernized and its boilers were updated from coal burning to oil firing, reducing its refueling time from several days to 6 hours or less. Thanks to new equipment, the engine room staff was reduced from 350 to 60 crew members. The Olympic's resilience was further revealed during the conversion work, when workers discovered a dent and a crack below the waterline that was caused by an undetonated torpedo. According to historian Mark Chirnside, the faulty projectile was launched from U-boat SMU-53 on September 4, 1918, as the Olympic sailed through the English Channel. She re-entered civilian service in mid-1920 and became as popular as ever, transporting an estimated 38,000 passengers throughout the year 1921 alone. The ship remained popular among rich travelers throughout the remainder of the decade, once again carrying celebrities, politicians, and even royal figures between Europe and North America. Many household names of the day passed through the ship, including silent film actor Charlie Chaplin, Nobel Prize-winning physicist and chemist Marie Curie, Canadian-American actress Mary Pickford, and Prince Edward. In an odd twist, the Olympics' similarities to the Titanic, which had relegated it to an undesirable status immediately after the wreck, were one of its biggest selling points throughout the 1920s. The ship was also a top choice among immigrants throughout the decade, when people flocked to the United States in droves to pursue a new life and future. When the US imposed strict immigration quotas toward the end of the 20s, the Olympics business took a severe hit. The White Star Line attempted to rebrand the ship as a tourist attraction, but its ridership was never restored to its former glory. During the early 1930s, further attempts were made to attract passengers by modernizing and upgrading the ship, but the Great Depression was in full swing, and it only served to further decrease the Olympics' passenger numbers. By the mid-1930s, the White Star Line and its competitor Cunard had merged at the behest of the British government. With plans in the works for newer and better ships, Old Reliable was officially slated for retirement. On April 5, 1935, she left New York for Britain for the last time. Later that year, after a handful of ideas for repurposing the ship failed to come to fruition, she was sold for demolition as a way to create desperately needed jobs. The Olympic was dismantled over the following 2 years, bringing her iconic 24-year career to a quiet end. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time. Bye.